Okay. Right. We'll start with a recap of what we have covered on the previous lesson. Right. We're going to start with what we have covered on the previous lesson. And I think you still remember that on the previous lesson we did aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That's what we have covered. So I'll start with a recap. Then after a recap, we continue from where we left. Right. So basically we talked about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Right. I'll start with the aggregate supply. Your aggregate supply is divided into two: the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. And we said the long run aggregate supply is a straight line vertically upwards. Why is it vertically upwards? Because it is independent of the price level. So we have price level and we also have what? The real GDP. And we said at this point, the long run aggregate supply is equals to the potential GDP. That's what we said. And we said movement along the long run aggregate supply is caused by a change in price level. Is equal to a percentage change in the wage rate. So if price increases by 10%, the wages they increase by 10%. So we remain at our potential GDP. And it is like this because it is independent of the price level. It is only influenced by the factors that changes the potential GDP. That's the long run aggregate supply. Then on the other hand, the short run aggregate supply, something like this, right? Diagonal. And what influences this, right? We have the price level and the real GDP at this point. In the short run, the wage rate and all other things are constant. What is changing is the price. That's what is changing. That's why it is something like this. So the price level obviously influences the short run aggregate supply, right? Then we joined them together, the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. And at this point, your long run aggregate supply is equals to your potential GDP, right? That is this point. Okay, we have price level and we have real GDP. And we said what causes this to shift, the long run aggregate supply to shift, what it causes it to shift. Example, human capital. It will cause it to shift. The more people that we have, the more productive we are, right? We also talk about capital investment. The more money resources that you have, the more you can shift your long run aggregate supply, which is also the potential GDP. And also technology is going to shift your long run aggregate supply. So when these items increases, the long run aggregate supply will shift to the right. In doing so, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the right as well. Right? It will shift to the right as well. It will shift to the right as well. So the short run aggregate supply will also shift to the right when these things increases. And when they decrease, obviously it will shift to the left. Right? That's what causes this to shift. Then we also talked about what can cause the short run aggregate supply to shift. Let's say we have the long run aggregate supply and we have the short run aggregate supply. It is influenced by the wage rate. When it changes, it will shift. So if the wage rate increases, right, it automatically means the cost of production increases. If the cost of production increases, what is going to happen to the companies? They'll cut production. Once they cut production, it means what? Supply will decrease. Once supply decreases, what is going to happen? The short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left. There we are. It shifts to the left because the wage rate has increased. In doing so, look at the price level. Look what happens to the price level. It goes up. Price level. Then the price level rises. Right. That's what influenced the short-run aggregate supply to shift. Right. Then we also talked about the aggregate demand. Right. This is your aggregate demand. Okay. Then if you still remember, aggregate demand is equals to capital plus investment plus government plus exports minus imports. So all these things, the total, the capital, the consumption, sorry, it's consumption, investment, government, exports and imports, still they give you the total for the aggregate demand. So we have price level here, and we have the quantity of the real GDP, right? And the reason why it is downward sloping like this, the reason is because of the wealth effect and substitution effect. We explained about the wealth effect, that if price level increase, I'll just give an example. If price level increases, your real wealth decreases. What is real wealth? What your money, your wealth can buy. So if price goes up, it means your real wealth decreases. For example, let's say you have 100,000. A house, this is the cash that you had. Then the price of house was 50,000. This is the price. Now all of a sudden, the price is now 100,000. So in terms of real wealth, in situation one, you have two houses. But in situation two, your real wealth is now one house. That's what we call the wealth effect. They go in the opposite direction. Price level increasing, obviously your wealth decreases. That's why it is negative sloping, because they're doing the opposite. If this increases, this decrease. You get it, right? That's the aggregate demand. Right. So consumption, investment, government spending, exports, imports, they all affect your aggregate demand. Right. So what can cause it to shift? What can cause our to shift? I gave so many examples. An increase in aggregate demand. One, cut taxes. If we cut taxes, what is going to happen? Consumption increases. Because if we cut taxes, you have more money to spend, then AD will shift to the right. There you go. What else? Government spending increases. If it increases, it means they are spending more. Therefore, the aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay. What else can cause this? The best way, just write this. Right? You can talk about the rand. If the rand depreciates, exports become cheap. As they become cheap, the demand for exports increases. If it increases, these exports, they go up, say therefore AD goes up, then the AD will shift to the right. And the opposite is true, right? The other thing is increase in money supply. Right. All these will cause our aggregate demand to go up. And the opposite, if we increase taxes, then it will reduce our aggregate demand. Right. Okay, that's what we talked about. Then we can combine the two, the long run aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand, like this. Then we say at this point where long run aggregate supply is equals to short run aggregate supply is equals to the aggregate demand, that's what we call the potential GDP. At that point, the potential GDP. And this point, we also call it full employment. At this point, we have utilized, we are at full employment, right? This is price level, and this is your real GDP. At this equilibrium, that's at full employment. Okay, right? So I'll just give an example. Let's say the government increases taxes. What is going to happen? If government increases taxes, it means consumption will decrease. If consumption decrease, what is going to happen? The aggregate demand will decrease. Therefore, it will shift to the left. There we are, shift to the left. And when it does so, the new equilibrium is now at this point. Let's say this was point A. Now we are at point B. Now at B, we are below full employment. Full employment. We are below full employment. This gap, when this happens, we call it a recessionary gap. Right? How can you close the recessionary gap? Let's say you want to close this gap. There are two things that you can do. One, you can increase the demand, the aggregate demand, by increasing government expenditure. You can do that. Or two, you can cut taxes. Or three, you can increase money supply. Once you do that, you are increasing what? Your aggregate demand. What else can you do? Right? The other thing that you can do, you can play around with your short-run aggregate supply. Your short-run aggregate supply. What can you do with the short-run aggregate supply in order to close this gap? Right? It has to increase. How does it increase? The short-run aggregate supply, remember, is the wage rate. You are going to cut or reduce the wage rate. Once you do that, the short-run aggregate supply will rise, will increase, because the cost of production is now low. I just give you an example. Okay, so this gap, we call it a recessionary gap. Okay, then let's go to another situation. Long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, then we have your aggregate demand. Okay, then you have price level and real GDP. Right, let's say in this situation, I want to to use a different example. Let's say the rand appreciates. Let me see if it is going to, the rand appreciates. Okay, the rand depreciates. The rand is depreciated, therefore exports become cheap. Therefore, demand for exports will increase. Therefore, aggregate demand will shift to the right. It's going to shift to the right. Now we are at new equilibrium. This is A, B, right? It shifts to the right. As it does so, price level, can you see the price? Price level rises, increases. So our price level has increased and we are above full employment. So we are above full employment and we have created a gap. Then a gap is inflationary. Now we have created the inflationary gap. So how do you close an inflationary gap? One, you can play around with your short-run aggregate supply. What are you going to do? Increase the wage rate. Right? Then the cost of production is now high. Then the short-run aggregate supply will decrease and it will shift to the left. Or you can play around with your aggregate demand. How can you decrease the aggregate demand? By increasing taxes. You cut government expenditure and you reduce money supply. All this is going to decrease our aggregate demand. Right, that's what we talked about. Okay, then I showed you the three business cycles that I've just explained there. Right, which are, right, we have three. We have the long run aggregate supply on all situations, the long run aggregate supply, right? Then we have the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply and, so it should be here, the aggregate demand and short run aggregate. So this is aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. This is full employment. This is below full employment. And at this point, we have a recessionary gap. This gap is called a recessionary gap, right? And at this point, we have an inflationary gap. It's above full employment. And we call this a inflationary gap. These are the business cycles that you can see. Okay. So you can present this on another graph. If it is a inflationary gap, we'll start at 0. This is 0, then, right? For example, in this case, we have what we call an inflationary gap. So inflationary gap, it's something like this. This is the inflationary gap. Then at equilibrium, then the recessionary gap will be at the bottom. So this gap is a recession. And this is an inflationary gap. Okay, right, that's what we did on the previous lesson, and I've explained also a bit further so that you understand what is happening. Okay, so we are going to continue. We are going to continue. We're going just to continue. Right. Okay. Right. Any questions? Any questions? If you have anything, please ask. Right, we talked about this last week, and I assume people are watching videos. They're not just waiting for things to be shown on a silver plate. Okay, right. So I just want to explain something. Right, on the previous lesson, I gave you example of China and German Hitler, what they were doing during World War. They were here focusing on human capital. Right, that's why it is overpopulated now. And in Germany, they were focusing on technological advancement. That's why it is so advanced in technology. Both situations, they usually shift the long run aggregate supply, which is equals to the potential GDP, to the right. They both shift to the right. Same here, technology can also shift it to the right. That's the same situation, right? Okay. So if this happened, then what causes inflation? What causes inflation? That's a key question, right? What causes inflation? And we know inflation is the persistent increase in price level that causes inflation. I'll just give an example. Let's say we have the long run aggregate supply. Then we are at this point at equilibrium, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. Then if aggregate demand increases, what is going to happen to the price level? Look at the price level, it goes up. Again, if aggregate demand continues to increase, look at what happens to the price level. It keeps on going up, right? But in the long run, the increase in price level will be equivalent to the increase in the wage rate. So what causes inflation is when a shift. Okay, let me draw it first so that I explain you when you are seeing the diagram. We have the long run aggregate supply, right? And we have our short aggregate supply. Okay, and this is the equilibrium. I want you to take note of something. This is the new equilibrium. If the long run aggregate supply is going to shift like this, and the short run aggregate supply is also going to shift like this, there is no inflation here because the long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply, they've shifted at the same percentage. You can see we are still at this point. We are still at this point A. So there's no inflation, but this is situation one. Let's go to situation two. Long run aggregate supply, right? Then it shifts to this point, long run aggregate supply. We're having the short run aggregate supply at this point, right? This is the equilibrium. Then the short run aggregate supply is just going to shift like this. look at the equilibrium, is now above. So if the long run aggregate supply more than the short run aggregate supply, now we are creating an inflation. So they did not shift at the same pace. Whenever there is a difference in the rate at where they shift, we are either creating inflation or deflation, depending on the rate at which each curve is shifting. Right. That's what causes inflation. Right. We call them fluctuations in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Right. And I think we all know what causes this to shift and this also to shift. This is potential GDP. What causes long run aggregate supply to shift is technology, human capital, and capital investment. And what causes the short run aggregate supply to shift is the wage rate. Okay, right. So let's now look further into what we call inflation cycles. Right, in this thing, inflation cycles, will be including all the three graphs. Right, what we call inflation cycles. Right, there are two types of inflation. Number one is called a demand pull inflation, and number two is called a cost push inflation. As the name suggests, demand pull, what causes it to shift is the aggregate demand, and the cost push, what causes it to shift is the short run aggregate supply. Right. So demand pull starts with the aggregate demand, and cost push starts with the short run aggregate supply. So let's start with the demand pull inflation. Right. We are at this point. Right. I'll be giving examples so that it will be so relevant. The long run aggregate supply. There we have it. And we are at equilibrium. Short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. This is demand pull inflation. Let's say one, then the government cuts taxes. What is going to happen when they cut taxes? Consumption is going to increase. Consumption increases, then what? Then the aggregate demand will shift to the right. There you go. So there is a demand pull inflation. So there we go. Here we are, right? Where are we in this graph? This was the equilibrium. Take note how I point my equilibrium. This was the equilibrium. Now this is the equilibrium. Check at the price level. It was here. Now it's here. The price has increased, right? So the increase in price is inflation. There we go. We have increased the price. Then there's going to be some adjustments for us to go back to the equilibrium. Now at this point, remember this is potential GDP. Now we are above full employment. Remember at potential GDP, this point we call it full employment. Now we are above full employment and we have created an inflationary gap. So how do we close the inflationary gap? Anyone? Right? So the short run aggregate supply is going to come into effect. So what is going to happen now? How do we close that? Short run aggregate supply. What is going to happen to the short run aggregate supply? For it to, then the wage rate increases. Remember, when people spend more, markets are booming, people are earning more, then the wages are going to increase. When wages are increasing, cost of production goes up. So when cost of production goes up, then the production goes down. In doing so, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left. Let's shift it. There you go. It was here. Now it's at this point. Short run aggregate supply. In doing so, look what is happening to the price level. It keeps on increasing. We are back to full employment, but the price is keep on increasing. Let's say it was bread. It was 10 rand. Now it's 12. Now it's 14. Right? Then the cycle repeats. Maybe number two, money supply increases. I'm just giving an example. When money supply increase, what is going to happen? The aggregate demand will increase. Then aggregate demand was here. It goes further again. We are at this point. We are now having a new equilibrium. Remember, we are using this, the next short run aggregate supply. We are at this point. Look at the price level. Now it's here. We are at 16. Then the short run aggregate supply will do the correction. In doing so, we go back to the potential GDP. In doing so, the price level keep on increasing to 18. Then the process repeats itself. The price keep on increasing. This is what we call the demand pull inflation. Demand increases first. Then the short run aggregate supply decrease, demand increase, short run decrease, demand, right? That's the process. That's the demand pull inflation. Right. Let's go to the cost push. Cost push initiated by the cost, which is the short run aggregate supply. Right. So the first thing that moves is the cost. Cost. And when we talk about cost in the supply chain, we are talking about the wages. Wages is the one of the production costs that is high. Workers will do the production. So we are talking about the wage rate. So I'll draw again. Long run aggregate supply equals to the potential GDP equals to the full employment. We have our aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and our aggregate demand. But in this case, it's going to be initiated by the cost, which is the short run aggregate supply. So let's say one, the wage rate rises, and it always continue to rise. Your wages will always continue to rise to, the wages in 1990 are different with the wages in 2020. Wage rate rises. What is going to happen? The short run aggregate supply will shift to the left. Right? Look, let's shift it. There we go. Right? Look at the new equilibrium. We're at this point. Now we are at this point. Price of bread was 10 rand. Now it's 12 rand. Then, for us to go back to the full employment, we have to do something. What are we going to do? Then we play around with the aggregate demand. Maybe the government is going to increase, just an example, government expenditure. Now the government has increased their spending. They will go back to our equilibrium at full employment. And in doing so, this is the new equilibrium. The price keep on increasing. The bread is at 14. As time goes on, the wages increases again. We go back to this point. We are at 16. The government comes to play so that we go back to full employment. Aggregate demand is going to increase. As we do so, bread is now at 18. The wages keep on increasing. We go back. We are now at 20. The government intervenes, or the monetary policy, by increasing money supply. Aggregate demand increases. In doing so, the price keep on increasing. So you see, we are creating inflation. So this is cost push. What first moves is the short run aggregate supply. Whereas in the demand pool, what first moves is the aggregate demand. Right. These are the two types of inflation. And you see how this inflation is done, how it comes about. right? So that's cost push and demand pull, inflation, right? Okay. Then the next part that we are going to talk about, this one is not a very long topic, right? We are going to see inflation in business cycles, what we call inflation in business cycles, right? Right, so we need to know there is what we call full employment. Full employment is when all resources are used, when long run aggregate supply is equals to the potential GDP, right? So now, if the aggregate demand grows at a faster pace than expected, then, as you know, the real GDP will be above the potential GDP, right? This is what I've been explaining, that if the aggregate demand grows at a faster pace than the real GDP, if aggregate demand grows at a faster rate than right, if it is grows faster at a faster pace than what is expected, we go above full employment. Right, just explaining these gaps that is happening. When it is here, it's above full employment. At this point it's above, and at this point it's below full employment. This is full employment, either we are above or we are below, right? Okay, so now we want to link these two with what we call unemployment. Remember, we're talking about employment. This is inflation and business cycles, and I think I've shown you what we did last week. When we are above full employment and below full employment, recessionary gap, inflationary gap, and full employment. Take note of this graph, and I explained how do we close these graphs. How do we close the inflationary gap? Right. Okay. So I'm just going to go to this part where we see the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Right. This model was developed by Phillips. So he described it as what we call a Phillips curve. Right. That's a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And it's divided into two. There is the short run and there is the long run. The short run Phillips curve and the long run Phillips curve. Right. So let's start with the short run Phillips curve. Let's start with the short run. Right. So I told you it shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So Phillips curve, we are going to have inflation on this side and we are going to have unemployment rate. Right. And from your own understanding, if inflation is high, do you think employment will be high or low? It's obvious when inflation goes up, in unemployment rate, okay, we just draw it. This is what we call the Phillips curve, right? And you just need to know it. And at this point, we are going to have what we call natural unemployment rate. At this point, natural unemployment rate. Okay. This is the short run. It's going to be quite different from the long run Phillips curve. So take note of this. Okay. Right. If I go back to the previous, I want you to take note of something, how we created the inflationary gap. Okay. Let me go back so that you can understand. Okay, let me draw it there. If we are here and we have the long run aggregate supply, just want you to take note of this, short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. If aggregate demand increases, we are creating an inflationary gap, right? This is inflationary gap because the prices have increased. But remember, aggregate demand has increased. It means the GDP has increased. So increase in GDP is going to actually lower unemployment. That's why you see that as the inflation goes up, look what happens to the unemployment rate. That's the relationship. Not too much inflation. Remember, inflation is good for the economy, but not too much of an inflation like hyperinflation. Because when aggregate demand increases, right? Remember, aggregate demand is equals to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. It has increased due to any of these factors. And remember, aggregate demand is equals to the real GDP. So real GDP has increased. There is more production in the country. What is going to happen? There's an inflationary gap that is going to be released. And look, we are above full employment. So you see that unemployment has to go down when we create that inflationary gap. That's where it is coming from. That's why it looks like this, right? So in other words, increase in aggregate demand decreases unemployment. That's the whole concept of the Phillips curve. That's when he came up with this Phillips curve, right? Okay. So we can cause a movement up or a movement down. A movement like this, it means the aggregate demand has increased. This is aggregate demand has increased. Here, aggregate demand has decreased. That's the Phillips curve. That's what you need to know, right? On the short run Phillips curve. We call this curve short run Phillips curve. The relationship between inflation and unemployment. Make sure you go back and revisit what I've explained there. Right. Now I'm going to go into the long run Phillips curve to show the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Right. Now in the long run, right, the long run Phillips curve is no longer downward sloping, the long run. It is now a straight line. There we have inflation and we also have unemployment rate. Why is it straight line now? Why is the long run Phillips curve a vertical line? Anyone? Anyone who knows? Okay, no one. Remember, in the long run, price and wages adjust. So an increase in price will bring about the same increase in wages. That's why it is a straight line, right? So if one thing in the long run, if you're buying bread for 10 rand, earning 1,000, in 2050, you'll be buying bread for 50 rand, but earning 50,000. That's in the long run. Inflation and unemployment, they'll be moving at a same rate. right? That's why it is a straight line like that. That's the long run Phillips curve, right? And at this point also it is equals to the natural rate of unemployment, right? I think you still remember what is the natural rate of unemployment. If you still remember those cyclic, unemployment, structural, all those kind of unemployment. And there's also what you call the natural.
Sir, please re-explain why it is it a straight line? I kind of didn't get that.
Okay, I will explain. I will explain again that point. Any other questions? Please ask if you didn't get it so that we can be on the same point. Right. Anyone, please, so that I can answer all. We have time. We still have an hour. Any question? Right. Okay. Let me explain in simpler terms. I'll try to break it again. Right. The first thing in the long run, just in simpler layman terms, in the long run, there's going to be inflation. Obviously, prices are going to increase. I'll just give an example. For example, bread, it costs 10 rand. Your salary is 1,000. After 10 years, bread will cost 20,000. But what is going to happen to your salary? It has also increased. That's the first basic concept. In the long run, everything adjusts. That's the first basic concept. So the long run Phillips curve is vertical because you see when the price level increases, your salaries increases. So does with now I'm going to take it to unemployment. This was with the wages and bread. Now I'm going to take it with the salaries. Sorry, with the unemployment rate. Why it is vertical. And at this point, I say this is what we call the natural rate of unemployment is equals to the long run Phillips curve. Right. The reason why it is straight, besides this first reason, is when inflation increases. I have to use also this graph so that you can see the short run. In the short run, remember from the short run, so that you can short run Phillips curve. Remember unemployment and inflation. If inflation rises due to increase in aggregate demand, there was also a decrease in unemployment. And for this reason, in the long run, this is a short solution. In the long run, there is no like what we call a permanent trade-off of increase in inflation with increase with decrease in unemployment. For example, okay, let me just give an example. Let's say I just want to make it in the short run. This is the long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. This is your aggregate demand. In the short run, the government, okay, government can increase expenditure, right? This is not permanent. It's a temporary solution. Therefore, we are at this point, right? We have created employment. Okay, I'll just give an example. Like now, government wants to deal with what do we call it, unemployment. So what did the government do? They decided that we need people who are going to help with matric to invigilate and do all sorts more stuff in order for them to cater to for the time lost. So they've increased government expenditure. People are going to earn a salary, and this is going to happen. Look what is going to happen to unemployment. It's going to go down. But this is not a permanent solution, remember. This is in the short run. So we have created an inflationary gap. Okay? Prices have increased, of course, because of an inflationary gap, as well as the aggregate demand has also increased, which means our real GDP has increased and we went above full employment. That's short run. What is going to happen 2 years from now? Now we are talking about in the long run, 2 years from now. This is not a permanent. That's why it is a temporal, like a temporal solution. So that's why we say there is no permanent trade-off. There's no permanent trade-off. It will go back to where it was after this short implementation by the government to eradicate some short-term unemployment. It will go back to where it was. It will still reduce, go back to this. So it's going to be vertical. We're still going to remain at natural unemployment in the long run. People, those who are not unemployed, will still go back to that unemployed. But in the short run, if it is like this, it can reduce unemployment in the short run, because these people have been employed by the government to cater for the time lost during COVID. But they are not permanent employees of the government. They will soon go back to natural unemployment. After exams, matric are written, you go back to where you are. That's why it is a straight line.
So we can't hear you.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so cool. Okay. I was saying, in the short run, there is no permanent trade-off. For example, if there is health workers that were needed to give a hand on COVID-19, and hospitals maybe use 1,000 masks in a month. That's the demand. So aggregate demand is going to increase like this. That's in the short run.
So we can't see your screen.
Yo. Okay, let me just share it. I forgot to share it again. So thank you for that. Okay, let me just repeat. I was saying in the short run, right? I gave an example of COVID-19, right? If there is COVID-19, it means government will recruit more health workers, but this is temporary. We'll need more PPE, the protective equipment, personal protective equipment for the health workers. Then the demand for this thing is high. But it's not going to stay there forever because it's in the short run. So when they do so, the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand will increase and will go above full employment. More people are now employed, but the price level has increased, causing an inflation. So as inflation goes up in the short run, the aggregate demand, the unemployment goes down. Hence why it is like this, the short run. But in the long run, this problem will be solved. We wouldn't want more health workers to deal with COVID. We wouldn't want the more protective equipment for COVID-19. What is going to happen? We go back. We remain at this point. Even if inflation keep on going up, the natural unemployment will always remain the same. That's why the long run Phillips curve is a vertical line, because in the long run, there is no trade-off. It's not a permanent trade-off. It's just a short measure, not a permanent. That's why there is no permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the long run. Right. That's the main reason there. There is only a trade-off in the short run. Increase in demand causes an increase in price level, people get employed. But after this pandemic, those people they'll still go back to where they were. They still need to go back and look for a job. But inflation will always be there at this point. But they'll go back to the natural unemployment in the long run. That's why it is like that. Right. Right. So what causes a change? Now let's talk about what causes a shift. Natural unemployment causes a shift. This is the one that can cause a shift in both long run Phillips curve and short run Phillips curve. If natural unemployment increases, then we are here. You go back to that previous topic on how you find the natural, those unemployment calculations. It was, I think, second topic. So if natural unemployment is the one that can cause this to shift. If you hear that there's a change in natural unemployment, then the long run Phillips curve is going to shift, as well as the short run Phillips curve, but it will still remain at the same level here in the short run. Okay, let me draw it on a nice. So this is the long run Phillips curve and the long run Phillips curve. It is straight line because there is no permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So if natural unemployment was 10, it changes to 20%. Therefore, the short run Phillips curve, something like this. This was the first equilibrium. Then it also shifts at the same pace to still remain at this point. Inflation. This is the long run Phillips curve, the long run Phillips curve, and short run Phillips curve, and short run Phillips curve. It shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. In the short run, as inflation goes up, the unemployment goes down. Why? Because the aggregate demand has increased. So we are above full employment. Inflation is caused by the increase in demand. When people demand more goods, it means the real GDP increase, production increase, people get employed. That's in the short run. But this happens in the short run. In the long run, there is no permanent trade-off. Things will go back to normal. We will remain at natural unemployment. That's why it is a straight line in the long run Phillips scale. Right, that's the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. Please, those who didn't attend the class, the previous class, watch the video. It's there on my LMS. Watch the video. It's a very important topic. They like to ask it. Right. So as to conclude, please go and find what causes, just for you to have described what causes the aggregate demand to move along. One, or what causes it to shift to the left or to the right. Then you find what causes the short-term aggregate supply, right? Two, one, a movement along, and two, a shift, either to the left or to the right. In the long run aggregate supply, two, one, movement along, and two, a shift to the left or to the right. Remember, this is equals to the potential GDP, right? And the shift here is caused by money wage rate. Just go and watch the first video. And the aggregate demand, oh, it's a lot. Taxes, government spending, money supply, expected future profits, and exchange rates. Right. Know all this. Once you know it, then you'll be able to be shifting all these graphs when they are joined together. I can say the rand appreciated, then what happens? I'm just going to give an example. If the rand appreciated, it means our exports are going to be more expensive. Then the demand will shift to the left. Simple as that. If I say man wage rate increased, it means short-run aggregate supply is going to be affected, then it will shift to the left. If I say government cut taxes, then you know aggregate demand is going to increase. If I say there was an improvement in technology, then you know your long-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. That's what I want you to study about that. Right. Any questions? Any questions on this one? Please start. You have a take-home test soon. And I've given you the take-home test that was written by other students. Go through it before I give you solutions. Practice it. We have covered 90% of what is in that paper. Right. So make sure you maximize on your take-home test. There is no problem if you get 100. Get that 100 so that you maximize for your first online assessment that you didn't do well. Right. Any questions? Please, if you find any question that you have that you want to ask, my WhatsApp is open. No one is asking me anything except one or two students who come and ask, oh, this happened. Ask anything, we'll be able to help you. Right, any questions? Let me download the register. Right, if you don't have any questions, thank you for joining. I'll upload the video in a few minutes. If you have any questions, I'm still here, you can ask me.